Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of the TRG webinar series brought to you by the Brain and Mind Center at the University of Sydney. And no, just kidding. We don't have another sponsor. It's just the Brain and Mind Center. Thank you for joining us again this week. Before we get into our great session that we have today, allow me to just remind you that we will have another ECR, that's an early career researcher series, where everybody who contacts us, you can contact either myself or Sally by email. You can get into this ECR series and promote some of your work. So if you're having challenges getting to a conference, either because of funding or because of travel, it's another great way to get exposure for your work as you grow your career. So with that in mind, I will pass the conversation over to my co-host, Sally Gainsbury. Sally.
Thank you very much, Kahlil. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm professor at the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic within the Brain and Mind Centre. Really pleased to have today Andrew Orbach, who is a gaming analyst at Taylor Collison, an investment firm in Australia. I really enjoy the emails I get almost daily from Andy, and people are often asking me how, as an academic, I'm so across, new technologies and trends and policy and industry movements. And it's because I read gaming and industry and regulatory news, and a lot of that is brought to me by Andy, who has a great summary for me. So thank you in advance, Andy, for all of that. And we're really excited to have you on because you have such a wealth of knowledge across the industry sector, which I think is just crucial for all stakeholders to understand, what are the influences on industry decisions? What is the consumer behavior and the regulatory impacts having on industry movements? Because these things are all interrelated, and research and policy will often follow or lag industry movements and vice versa. So we're really keen to hear your insights. We could, I'm sure, talk for a full day on this. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, because we're going to be jumping around between topics. So this is your chance if you are watching live. But Andy, I was hoping you could start by introducing yourself and particularly your background.
Sure. Firstly, Sally and Kahlil, thank you for having me. It's a very useful webinar in my view, in terms of, as you say, working together with all the stakeholders. In terms of my background, it's quite unusual. I was a professional gambler for the better part of 20 years. So I spent probably the first 5 years of my life, probably from about a 16-year-old, using my brother's ID, going into the Adelaide casino. And I played in card counting teams that traveled around the globe. We were quite successful at that. At the tail end of that, I have then moved into the wagering space. So wagering on horse racing and also on sporting outcomes. It was done in a very scientific approach. We would maintain databases. We would build mathematical models trying to predict outcomes of events. And we would then bet into liquid markets with wagering operators across the globe. So I did that for probably the better part of 15 years. During that period, I did some investment qualifications called a CFA. The market kind of changed during the period. So the bookmakers changed their MO. They used to let you bet large sums. They kind of restricted you quite heavily during that period. So there came a day where the writing was on the wall. We were still doing quite well, but not as well as we formerly had. I moved across at that point subsequently to working on the sell side. So as a gaming analyst for a brokerage firm, I now cover major listed gaming entities across the globe. So in Australia, we're talking Aristocrat, your Tabcorps, Flutter globally, the casino space, the slot space, and also some other little nuanced areas, some social casino companies, etc. So have a pretty solid understanding of all the products that they offer, to some extent understand the mentality of gamblers and how they think, and very happy to share, to the extent I can, the way the market thinks about some of these products and some of these companies and the movements that are occurring, whether they be technological or just in terms of risk appetite.
That's great. Thanks for that background, Andrew. I want to ask you a question, since you do have such a diverse background and understanding of different products. I want to ask you a question about sort of the omni-channel consumer. And the reason why I want to ask you that question is because oftentimes when we're doing gambling research or even on the advocacy side, we're very product focused in saying things like in-play betting is very risky, or just online casinos are very risky. But we're very focused on the product as opposed to thinking about the whole customer journey in a way that they might interact with many different products. So my understanding is that a lot of businesses now are very much focused on creating an omni-channel consumer. Is that the right view? And what's the sort of trajectory of the way that businesses are thinking about these things?
I think if you look at it, it's probably a two-part question, Kahlil. If you look historically, I don't think necessarily the omni approach was the way that everyone would go. There was certainly, you had your monopolistic operators. In the case of Australia in the wagering space, you had Tabcorp, who obviously had all the retail exclusivity, total exclusivity across Australia. So they were considered the omni guys. Then you had Sportsbet who came in and they were just online, and off the back of that, you had a whole lot of corporate bookmakers who were doing just fine playing in that online space. Their view was that they could cannibalize off of the retail. So as online became a larger chunk of the market, they were basically cannibalizing off of Tabcorp's business. What we've seen subsequently, though, is a number of things. One, we know that omni-channel customers are worth a whole lot more. Occasionally, you'll see listed companies who'll provide information. I think TLC, so the Lottery Corp, have provided that sort of detail in terms of customers of theirs that wager or buy lottery tickets both in a retail and an online sense, and they're worth, from memory, like 2.5 to 3 times as much as somebody who's either pure retail or pure online. We've seen similar sort of dynamics in terms of what happens in the wagering space, where omni-channel customers are worth a hell of a lot more. What we're now seeing is a little bit of a pivot from some of the online players, and it's off the back of some of the more recent recommendations and just the natural movement of the way the market's going from a regulatory point of view, where the value of having a retail presence arguably will increase. So if you have gambling restrictions, as in advertising restrictions, inducement restrictions, how, as a listed player, do you get your message out? And the answer is, generally accepted, you have a retail presence. So the value of, in this case, Tabcorp's retail exclusivity in Australia, should we enter into a period where there's restrictions on advertising, restrictions on inducements and those sort of things, the value of that goes up. So yes, we are now seeing renewed interest, and the Victorian wagering license is an interesting one that's coming up shortly. The announcement for that, it was probably dead and buried 6 months ago. It seemed like Tabcorp pretty much had a mortgage on that. Now we've probably got a situation where Sportsbet have been, so owned by parent company Flutter, have probably had renewed interest. We've seen Entain take out the New Zealand in terms of the running of the New Zealand TAB, and in all likelihood, we're going to see something similar, I believe, in terms of what we see play out in Western Australia. So in answer to your question, I think for 10 years, there was probably a period where a lot of the online players weren't that concerned by omni-channel, but recently, yes, definitely. And again, if you look broader than that and you start to look at casinos, let's say over in the US, again, very, very much you can lever off having the retail-based player. And yes, they want to be continuing on to be engaged. We know that traditionally they want to be, they have a penchant to be linked to brands and products that they know. So if you're used to playing with an Aristocrat brand poker machine, when you go into a casino, when you go home at night, if you still would like to gamble online, the tendency is to trust and to know and to trust that brand. And so to the extent that you can deliver omni-channel content, and again, that's where all these suppliers are moving towards, to making sure that there's portability of content across all the verticals so that it's available, then yes, there is a movement towards that.
I think you've raised some really interesting points there. consumer behavior, trust, loyalty, preference just for the ease of going with something, because I wanted to ask about, there are different obviously jurisdictions, and our audience is international. In Australia, we have a very competitive market, and when people ask me, what is it about Australia that is unique, that's one of the things I point to, is how many different players there are and stakeholders, even within a single type of gambling or gambling activity. So can you talk about, if we think about, just tick up on this online, we've got now what were corporate bookmakers, some big corporate bookmakers, the national bookmaker, but we've also got quite a lot of smaller players who were on-course bookies who've obviously gone online, and it's, how do they compete, or what is it about the market for a consumer to go with a smaller operator or having multiple accounts? Can you kind of unpack how
Sure.
you see the Australian wagering landscape in that sense?
Yeah, sure. So if you go back again, I'll just give you a brief history. You had Tabcorp, who had retail and tote exclusivity, which back 15 years ago was the only way anyone bet. So they had effectively 100% of the market. You then had some NT licensed bookmakers, being the corporate bookmakers, who entered into the market. Again, they were just purely online. They grabbed a large proportion of the market as the market naturally migrated across to online. I guess unexpectedly, probably about 2 years ago, and that's probably off the back of point of consumption tax and the imposts that produces, and high cost of race field fees. So high costs for operators. The expectation was that the big scale guys would come good, and that to some extent has happened. But in the journey, we've probably had a 2 or 3 year period where a whole lot of smaller players who effectively had advantages. They get carve-outs from race field fees, they get carve-outs from point of consumption if they remain below a certain level. So as long as you are a small-scale player, the racing industry is effectively saying, we don't mind you growing, you need the opportunity to grow, and we'll give you some benefits whilst you remain small. So these players then looked to have online offerings. As we know, the cost of developing these apps and developing all the digital solutions is quite expensive. So along came a whole lot of platform players. So some B2B players, BetMakers as an example. There's other platforms that are in the market as well. Hamish Davidson has one. And off the back of that, what they offer is they offer the operator a digital solution, a white label digital solution, which provides them with, I'm not going to say everything that Sportsbet provides them with, but a quasi version of that. In answer to your question, how do you compete with that? It requires a number of players to jump on that platform. So if you are, for example, BetMakers, and you are trying to compete with Sportsbet or Flutter, you need to have quite a lot of scale in terms of having a lot of people who jump onto your platform. When you do that, you probably have a war chest that allows you to invest in R&D to develop your product. And that was pretty much what we were hoping to occur with BetR when they launched. So they went onto the BetMakers platform. They locked in a contract where they were paying X million dollars per year. That kind of provided BetMakers, along with all their smaller scale operators, with an opportunity to invest, to improve their product. Now, there's still, my response is, ultimately it does get down to product, and when you look at what Flutter has and the global scale it has, and the ability to roll things out, whether it be through FanDuel or through Paddy Power or through all of their assets, Sportsbet over here, it's very hard to compete. They have, I think at last count, they've got 2,000 engineers who are working on their team, always trying to drive new product, always trying to innovate. It makes it incredibly difficult for anybody, even at scale, to compete with them, let alone the sub-scale operators. So the answer is, in answer to the question, Sally, that the smaller players, there is a capital light approach. It involves jumping onto one of these platforms, entering into a revenue sharing agreement, and it allows you a rapid way to get to the market quickly. It's clean, it's capital light, and it's proven at the lower level. It's still yet to be proven at the top level. Time will tell whether that will eventuate.
Yeah, I'm curious if you think that same phenomenon is what's happening in the United States or could happen in the United States, where it seems to be on the betting side, mostly a 2-horse race, kind of a 2.5-horse race in terms of the brands that have been successful domestically here. Is that just as a function of like the way that that margins work in this industry and the scale that you need to operate? Is that just kind of the long-term equilibrium, do you think?
The scale piece is huge. The product piece is huge. There's quite a number of reasons why, as you talk about a 2-horse race, I mean, up till only about 3 months ago, or maybe even 6 months ago, FanDuel were dominating that space. So FanDuel, again, is owned by the same company as Sportsbet, being Flutter. They had, in my view, the best product. They had very high penetration rates of same-game multi, or as they call it over there, same-game parlay. That is a very high margin product, which will afford them a huge war chest to then compete, and to be very heavy on the generosity. So it was effectively a model where if you look at same-game multis and what they do from an operator perspective, as I say, very high margin. So you're taking funds away from the customer at a very high rate, higher than they're typically aware of. But that's not enjoyable, and it's probably not sustainable to take funds at that higher rate. So in the other hand, you'll provide back in the form of generosity. So you'll give free bets to a player. And the net effect is actually remarkably similar. So if you were to take funds away from a player at 12 or 13% in the first place, which might be a long-term sustainable type rate, in this case, they might be taking funds away at 20% and then giving back in terms of generosity at 8%. So the net effect is still you're taking funds from at 12% away from the customer, but the customer will engender more loyalty, and it will deliver more utility to the customer than if they just lost at 12% in the first place. So you've got, going back to your question, you've got Sportsbet with great product, with really high same-game multi penetration, which allows them to engender in terms of giving back so much more loyalty. So they've been pretty dominant. So it makes it very hard for anybody else to compete when you have, you know, world's best brand, world's best marketing, world's best product, world's best innovation. They are, you know, they're a behemoth, and they're very hard to compete with. DraftKings has in the US has got its act together. So yes, the scale players, then the benefits of scale start to occur. So the benefits of advertising. So if you look, for example, historically, if you wanted to advertise into New Jersey, you had to also advertise. It's a tri-state marketing deal. So if you advertise on above the line, so onto TV, in New Jersey, you'd have to go into New York and also into Pennsylvania. So if you have presence in all 3 of those states, you get more bang for your buck by advertising there. And now we're seeing that go even further, where if you advertise across all of North America, yes, we might only be live in 20 states in North America currently, or 25 states, but it is actually cheaper to advertise rather than doing individual states on a national approach. And you then get the added benefit that you get the exposure in next wave markets as they slowly open and get enabling sports wagering legislation. Hey, people are already familiar with the FanDuel brand. They're familiar with the DraftKings brand because we're advertising at a national level already. So there's a lot of advantages to being at a national level and to having scale. Going back to your question, can the small players? I still think that we're seeing a whole lot of consolidation because of the benefits of scale. We're seeing a whole lot of the smaller players leave. And so that consolidation actually has interesting sort of ramifications because of the fact it makes licenses available again in some of these states. So much like in Australia, where we saw the scale, this all play out and the consolidation play out, and everyone thought, well, it's just going to be a 3-horse race. Well, that's when the platform players came into being. And it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, for now, I don't see it occurring, but at some point, is it logical that if you had an existing database and you're a casino group or you're a racetrack, you don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal about how to run a sports book operation, but you have a database which we know already punts. We know that cross-sell is possible in a lot of these verticals. Is it possible that as a license becomes available at a much cheaper cost than what it was formerly available to you for market access, that you might jump onto a platform and off the back of that, let them be a one-stop shop and they provide a white label to you and you can just use your existing customer database to leverage, to lever off? Yeah, I still think that's possible. But to be clear, the movement at the moment is distinctly away from B2B offerings. People would like, the major operators want to have control of their own tech stack and control of their own destiny. So to that extent, we're not seeing that currently.
And you've raised so many points, and I do want to get onto some of the other products. You're very knowledgeable about a lottery and land-based retail, but I'm curious just to pick up on one of those points about advertising across US. And we're currently seeing the US make all the same mistakes that have occurred in Australia, which is a little bit mind-boggling, but every day I'm reading articles about people being surprised that problem gambling rates are going up because advertising is going through the roof. I'm like, well, this happened in the UK, it happened in Australia, all the other jurisdictions are pulling madly back on ads, and America is just going gung-ho. So obviously we have had conversations here on this webinar about the recent online gambling report. I'm curious how you see the industry operate, and the current report is only recommendation, so there's no legislation being proposed at the moment. We're waiting for the government response, but from some extent I would have thought that the big operators would be happy to forego advertising because they've already got market share. It would make it very difficult for smaller operators. But in the bigger picture, and interesting that one of you said about the point of operating across a state where you're not even in, because it's just about increasing awareness. And that's one of the big concerns about gambling advertising, is that it is increasing the normalization of gambling in Australia. So I was just wondering if you could talk to the extent that the industry is proactive in terms of trying to putting things in place to avoid regulation, is responsive to regulation, the extent to which kind of regulation impacts the industry product and development, as to the extent that you can talk to.
Yeah, I think I'm a little cynical about this, Sally. You've raised some really good points, but I think ultimately the situation to me is quite conflicted. If you are a leading sportsbook operator, and yes, they are packing in everything that we've packed in Australia over a 15-year period into 2 or 3 years, right? So it's on steroids, everything, but making the exact same mistakes and the same stuff that happened over in the UK, which has driven the white paper, et cetera, over there and the recommendations over here. But because of this situation, the logical way to sit back is to go, all right, let's not make the same mistakes that we've made over here. We've got a fresh, canvas, and we can make this look however we want. It's conflicted because if you are FanDuel or if you are DraftKings or you're one of the major operators, you want to keep your foot on the floor. You want to get as much footprint as you possibly can. Inevitably, they're going to have their Tom Waterhouse moment. They're going to have their moment where people just sit back and go, right, that's too much. You've stepped over the line. But until then, it's in their self-interest to keep going as hard as they can. So I sort of struggle with it. Oh, I don't struggle with it. I struggle morally with the concept of what they do. I struggle less from a economic point of view. I get it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It is. I too would do the same. What we've seen, if you look at one of the major reasons that DraftKings and FanDuel have performed so well over in the US, apart from all the things I listed before, amazing product, amazing brand, amazing innovation, amazing tech, is they have structural advantage through the DFS platform. So the daily fantasy sports, they can go in to next wave markets, they can advertise and gain a whole lot of users through daily fantasy sport. They acquire users at roughly 1/3 of the cost of acquiring a sports wagering user, and they have very high degree of success rates of cross-sell. So they can cross-sell that existing DFS customer that they've acquired far cheaper, and 70 or 80% of them, or I think it is, maybe it's high 60s, something around that sort of level, will indeed be happy to play when we have enabling legislation into sports wagering. So they have a structural advantage where they move in there. They've done a very good job levering off that and continue to lever off that. So it's almost the same example. Now, what we know, since I've covered, getting close to 10 years covering listed companies, there's a lot of talk about, cross-selling off of databases, and a vast majority of them just aren't successful. Customers have different habits. So we used to have Tats, who had the lottery, who basically had the lottery asset in Australia, and also had UBet, so had some wagering operations as well. And we would hear all the time about how they could cross-sell their customers. They were going to embark on a program to cross-sell their customers from lotteries into wagering. Well, it was never really successful. And we've heard about from Star Group, who partnered up with Chaitau Fook and Far East Consortium as joint venture partners. And we heard how they would cross-sell and mine their database. And that was never successful. And we heard about Sunbets over in the UK, the ill-fated Tabcorp, News Corp JV, and how they would, again, cross-sell. And that was ill-fated. BetR recently ill-fated, again, for totally different reasons. And it's still going. And they're like a phoenix from the ashes. I'm sure they'll rise again. But the point being, some databases are useful to cross-sell and some aren't. For DFS, we know does particularly well in regions where gambling is illegal, because it's quasi-gambling. It's a way of sort of getting doing the work and doing some background work on teams and trying to, yes, I can't have a $10 wager on it, but instead I'll enter into a competition using my skills for $10. So the cross-sell, we know in that case, is very strong. So the advertising, it's much like the DFS play, where all of a sudden you get this scenario where you've got the brand awareness, you've got the loyalty. It's not as good as having DFS players in terms of that cross-sell, but it certainly helps them. And we've now seen in recent launches in North America that those that have already who have started at the national advertising, they're getting even stronger numbers off the bat. And we know that when you move into a next wave, into a market that just launches, the low-hanging fruit is available. You need to be on the start line to get the low-hanging fruit. The people who are really hanging to gamble and who have always wanted to gamble and are really interested, and I can't wait, this is going to be an amazing moment. You need to be on the start line. So the value of having that presence already there, to have that brand loyalty, to have the brand awareness, is significant.
Do you think, from a valuation standpoint, that the problem gambling issue and potential responsible gambling regulation is overrated or underrated?
I think it's definitely underrated. As in, I'm not sure how you're framing that. Moving forward, if I'm looking forward, I think the risk of regulation having a material impact on wagering operators, well, not just wagering operators, pretty much all gambling operators, has been underrated, other than casinos. We've seen it play out in casinos. We've seen royal commissions and inquiries recently. We've seen now, I think it's probably arguably been overplayed in the casino space, because we've just seen such an onerous compliance requirement. We've seen such a significant hit in terms of top line from a revenue perspective, what it's meant, and from an earnings perspective. So I think we're now seeing casinos off the back of the inquiries being held to account at a very high level, particularly relative to other venues in Australia, particularly relative to pubs and clubs, in my view. So if you're looking at in our case, we'll look at Endeavour and say we can perceive risk there, because again, what we're seeing in terms of the regulatory, the responsible gaming piece, the AML CTF piece, I'm pretty convinced that casinos are administering gambling now, and we're talking about now and moving forward, in a more responsible fashion than we're seeing from other venues.
Do you think that created a different type of exposure, where previously it was responsible gambling regulation was really more of like a cost line item, and now it's more of a risk to the top line revenue?
It's now both. At an individual cost line, yes, we're seeing the impost, we're seeing all the fines, We're seeing the cost of compliance. We're seeing the layers of bureaucracy and legal and everything and it's not pretty. From a casino perspective, it's, you know, it's many tens of millions of dollars a year. Yeah, so it's both. But I acknowledge your point. I think if you go back 5 years, it was just it was lip service, and now it's a genuine risk, and it's a reflection on society. And to me, it's a reflection on where we're going, and probably a reflection on how hard some of these operators, depending on which industries, have pushed the envelope.
I think that raises a really interesting point, that there is now a much more focus on the social license and the community expectation that there be something done around responsible gambling in different areas. We've seen it a little bit more in the online space. We've seen it certainly in casinos, particularly with the anti-money laundering layered on top of that. As you say, we see clubs and hotels in particular, and potentially lotteries, lagging in Australia at least on that, because there is this still these conflicts of interest. Obviously, there's the revenue. There's also the community sentiment to do something about it, but the punter sentiment, the actual customer, they don't want to be restricted. They don't want anything to change. So how are industry proceeding with this risk that of what I've been arguing for is thinking about this sustainable business model where you don't bleed your customers dry, but you actually, you know, put in a safer gambling or a more sustainable gambling model? Are there movements to change the product, to change the environment, to retain customers over a longer life period, as opposed to just this churn and burn model that we've seen with very few protections in place?
I would say no, and it raises interesting questions. Effectively, what you're seeing, I'm going to generalize and say operators are moving towards higher margin product over time. So whether it's in the wagering space, and that's through customer demand, these same game multi sort of products are very high margin. Cash out is very high margin, to the extent that you can bet in play, which obviously you can't bet online in play on sport here in Australia, but that's high margin as well. So my first response is higher margin products, and you see that in casinos as well. You had traditional sort of blackjack style games or baccarat style games, which I'm used to. I would now walk into a casino floor and I barely recognize what's going on. And I mean, I played the game professionally, blackjack, for many years, and I look at the games now, and there's all these little side bets, and you bet $3 and it might win 1,000. And I think again that gets back to this movement in punter preference. And punters in general want to move or have the appetite for small outlay for larger payoffs, so more lottery style derivative outcomes. And the problem with that is when you get these large payoffs, operators tend to put higher margins in there. So straight away you're dealing with higher margin products, which means customers are losing at a higher rate than what they formerly did. And so what do you then do? I mean, it's effectively, if you are losing at 25% as the example in a same game multi-product, you're emptying your pocket in 4 bets, and that's not sustainable. Like the punter might not be necessarily clever enough to work out the rate that they're losing because of the complexities of modeling these sort of bets, but subconsciously they know whether their gambling experience is fun or not. And so what the operator in turn does is gives back bonuses, gives back. So we're entering into this phase where it's even the lotteries are interesting. What we were seeing a lot of last year was there's a requirement if you're a lottery operator here in Australia, you need to pay out 60% of ticket volumes of sales back to the customer in the form of prizes. Now that is a long term, that's over the course of a year, and that never deviates. What you're allowed to do, though, in the short term is pay back as little as 55% to the customer. And you can retain that other remaining 5%, and you can put it into a thing called a prize reserve. Now, the prize reserve is allowed or is used to guarantee prize payout. So if you say tonight we're going to guarantee $100 million payout, and we only sell enough tickets to fund 80 million, I can use 20 million from my prize reserve to guarantee that. Now, what happens is, as these prize reserves build up over time, we can we can offer larger prizes from the start. So rather than starting off on a $4 million prize for Powerball, we can say, let's play tonight for 8 million. Who wants to play for 8 million? And all of Australia goes, yes, please, because that's bigger than what I'm used to. Or we can play for 100 million in the fourth week of a sequence instead of what we used to play for 30 million. And that, the act of doing that actually stimulates, stimulates sales. So we are, to me, it's kind of the same sort of thing where you're actually not necessarily paying back the punter as much as you have to. Now, to be clear, over time, the Lottery Corp still pays out 60%. It's never their money. They're never holding on to it. They're not claiming to hold on to it. They're just paying it out in a staggered fashion, which if you're a shareholder, you like, because it engenders more sales. So what we're getting to is higher margin product, possibly not paying everyone out as much as you normally would in terms of the actual immediate payout, the return to player, but giving it back in another format. You can play for bigger prizes and hey, then you get the money back then. Or in the case of same game multi, we'll give you a free bet. If your side's up at 3/4 time and loses, you get your money back. All this generosity, which is kind of to some extent funded by the war chest that is provided by having such high margin product. So in terms of the punter appetite, they don't realize the rate that they're losing at. I've spent a lifetime following margins and looking at this sort of stuff, and I just sit there scratching my head going, why in the hell would you be playing in that space? But I'm not the target market, and I can accept that. I understand the movement from a listed company point of view because, hey, this is more profitable. And we like the concept, if we're a listed player, rather than, hey, we might win at 12%, depending on the fluctuations and the results of, outcomes of sporting events or horse races, and we're at the whim of the sporting gods. We can actually win at 25%, and we can totally control that we give 13% back. So we can still hit our target margin of 12%, but all of a sudden it's totally our choice what margin we end up with, as opposed to, previously where it would go up and down. And I think at the end of the day, the operators know full well you can fleece a lamb many times, you can slaughter it but once. They don't want to win at 25%. They know they're competing. This is entertainment. This is competing against other entertainment brands. If they take money off of customers at 25%, it's not sustainable. They know that. And that's why they give back the generosity, and that's why you're not going to see margins sort of there's a view that margins will continue to expand as same game multis and same game parlays, the penetration rates of those go higher. The answer is there's only so much room that they've really got before this is no longer an enjoyable experience for the punter. And hey, I'm losing at too quick a rate, and I'd rather spend my $100 going to the movies and getting a burger and having a beer.
Yeah, that was always the discussion back when I lived in Vegas, and all the blackjack tables were transitioning from 3 to 2 payouts to 6 to 5. I'm
sure.
Never really followed how that wrapped up. I have a different question for you though. As I understand it, in Australia, the country is looking at online casino as a potential product. And if I have that wrong, then we'll just strike that from the record, and I'll just talk about America.
You got that wrong.
So last week at the Global Gaming Expo, a big part of the conversation was that there was so much opportunity in the domestic market for the growth of online casino. And I wonder if perhaps the industry is a little overexcited about the opportunity there because they had so much success on the sports betting side. And as I understand the sports betting issue, a lot of people see it as something that's closer to lottery, where it's not really quote unquote gambling as much as online casino might be. I'm just curious about what your view is for new markets and the growth of online casino, because it seems like it's kind of the next product frontier that every operator would want to be in on, but not necessarily that every community would want to have available.
But when sports wagering opened over there, Kahlil, there was very much a focus to begin on just growing the market, like just focus on turnover or handle, as they call it over there. Over time, after 2 or 3 years, the market very much pivoted, and they wanted to see, with the high rates of burn in terms of the cost of acquiring customers, they wanted to see profitability. They wanted to see EBITDA. So off the back of that, we've seen some pretty significant pivots by a lot of companies. What we know is casino iGaming over there is a lot more profitable from in terms of the users, the cost of acquisition, and the lifetime value equation is far more compelling. So we have seen a real pivot, and some of the companies did it really well from the start. BetMGM were really focused on social casino, so that it's not necessarily even cross-selling the existing customer database. There is a degree of that, but we're talking about just dedicated customers who will only bet in an iCasino fashion. So firstly, you have the actual operators focusing on it more, pushing it more. But ultimately, we thought off the back of COVID that there might be opening of new market. There were, potentially governments who were looking to balance their budget, so potentially the tax revenue that was being foregone and that argument. It hasn't really opened up as rapidly as we expected. There's still only 6 states that offer iCasino over there in North America. There's some other products that are doing particularly well, sweepstakes style models, which are doing well and gaining some share over there. There's social casino, which has probably been knocked around by the IDFA deprecation by Apple, but still sits there in the background spitting out cash. The problem is, in my view, and I, to be honest, I bow to the wisdom of Eilers and Krajcek and these guys over there who cover the market really closely over in North America. And the view is that even at maturity with sports betting, you might have 47 states who might be offering sports wagering in 20 years, 30 years, whatever it might look like. Whereas the view is you still might only have 20 states at maturity from an iCasino perspective. And that's for the exact same reason that it's, you don't have it here in Australia. It's politically, it's not, it's suicide to be going down that path, opening increasing the gaming net, so to speak. And on top of that, it's just, that sometimes the population just don't want it. So in this case, the further it can be put off, it's harmful from an operator perspective. They would love to see that market open up, because if you look at the revenues that are being generated from iCasino relative to sports betting, it's the ratio is very different, as in very heavily weighted towards iCasino.
Yeah, my comment on that would be looking at the UK, where we now see people who are seeking help from the gambling treatments. It's over 50% for online casino, particularly amongst women, the bingo, the casino, and you just have to see the ads. And I'm not in the UK often, but the ads of, housewives sitting bored at the table, they're pretty targeted in their marketing. So I'm certainly not, from a problem gambling point of view, in any rush to see anything like that. But what I do want to pick up on is that idea of innovative products and consumer demand. A few years ago, or even 10 years ago, the land-based clubs and gaming machine markets were wringing their hands that new customers weren't coming in, the new generation. And the race into, to some extent, also talk about this as how do we make this product attractive to a new generation. But I'm less interested in any industry concerns and whether they're making money. Don't particularly enjoy those conversations, having to sit through them. But I'm interested in what products are being innovated for I don't even know what the TikTok generation. I don't know what we're calling new people coming in, becoming of age. And as you say, even pre-marketing, developing products for people to be aware of before they even become of legal age to gamble. What are you seeing in terms of technology developments or testing the market, Andy?
It feels to me like it's a lot more on the margin, Sally, than actual new products. It feels like it's working in. So Dabble's a good example of a wagering operator over here who are doing very well. They're very cluey guys. They're far more socially oriented than existing wagering operators. So offering in-app chat, which allows people to, one of the names of the game is to keep people inside your ecosystem. So if you've got the Sportsbet app, once you insert vision into that so that people can watch races and not have to leave, that increases engagement. The same sort of thing if you look at same game multi. So when people place a same game multi, so that's That's a product where you can bet on numerous outcomes within the same match. If you go back 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they wouldn't allow that. It was called a related contingency. So if I was to wager on the outcome of, let's say, a cricket match, and it's David Warner to score 100 into Australia to win the match, win the test match, well, as soon as David Warner scores 100, it changes the probability of Australia winning the cricket match. So they'd say, we can't do that. We can't touch that. Well, over time, they did modeling of that, and that allowed them to give up a price. And so now we've seen same game multis become, such really prolific, and a lot of the products are derivatives of that sort of thing. So you've got same race multi, the customers just can't get enough of that. So that's probably the number one game-changing product that we've seen. But when you look at someone like Dabble, they're probably well, in the case of a same game multi, what Sportsbet did is they introduced a tracker. So what would happen? You'd put in the AFL context, you'd back Buddy Franklin to kick 5 goals, into Isaac Heaney to have 30 touches, into the Sydney Swans to win. So you needed those 3 things. Some of these things can be 10 legs or 15 legs, as many legs as you want. Now, what would happen invariably is that the punter would then be watching the match on TV and would go to the AFL app and try and work out how they were going. Sportsbet then got a really good product, really clever product, which is a same game multi-tracker. And it would have a direct feed from the AFL website, from the AFL feed, and it could tell you with a ticker across how every leg of your bet was going. So if you've got 15 legs in this multi, you need 15 legs to all salute for you to be paid. And you can see tick, 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 cross, tick, tick, tick. Oh, Isaac Heaney's only got 28 touches. I need him to get 2 more, and it increases engagement. And it also, importantly, retains the customer on the app. So what we're seeing increasingly is, in terms of product innovation, are products that are designed to keep the customer within your ecosystem. We don't want them going somewhere else to watch the vision. We don't want them going somewhere else to check the stats. Let's provide them with a one-stop shop where they can happily sit there all day, and when they want to bet, they can bet, and they can get all the information they want. They can get all the form they want. So where Dabble has been very successful in terms of the chat. So there's increasing focus on getting these groups together, bet with mates type products where you can socially interact with your friends, with your mates. And the problem again is, what do I do in that scenario? If I want to chat about a horse that I'm going to back, I get onto WhatsApp. It's a WhatsApp group that sits on the side. I'm leaving the ecosystem of Sportsbet. I'm leaving the ecosystem of Dabble. Well, increasingly, they're trying to offer solutions that allow you to chat in app.
Is there anything in the clubs or hotel space or manufacturer space for gaming machines? Because that's always been something that has struggled to attract a younger audience.
I think, you would know better than me, Sally, what COVID did. There were some benefits undoubtedly off the back of COVID and the audience that they attracted at that point. The challenge then becomes the stickiness of those customers. Do they, once COVID's sort of, people can go outside again and play golf and go and do 27 other things. Do they, is there stickiness and retention in that customer database? I would say that they're not when I say not keeping up, I would say less so in the club and pub space. I'm going to generalize again and say that I see slots as more of a not isolating, but a journey that you tend to take on your own. The people like to have a bit of privacy generally about their gameplay, and they like to be, you see that some of those little nooks and crannies that they set up in the pubs seem to perform very well. I don't necessarily think it's a journey you like to share. I think, ironically, wagering was probably the same 10 years ago, where you'd have a bet and you probably, didn't want other people knowing what you're betting on, or to the extent that you're betting, or what you're losing. You certainly might not want your partner knowing that, and that still might be the case. But increasingly, they have been successful at making it a social experience, a shared experience. Dabble has a has a button, like a really clever, innovative product, which is a replicate bet, effectively, like a copy bet. So you can follow your sporting hero, or you can follow somebody who's been on a really good run, and you can just click a button and hey, this is what I'm doing, and you click a button and you can replicate that bet and change your staking or whatever. Again, I just I come from a different background and I have zero interest in that. But I'm not the target market. I'm not the 20-year-old who does get some appreciation out of that. I think if you go back, it's just been a real changing, particularly in the wagering landscape. It used to be filled with people who would sort of do a bit of form and try and understand what was going on. Would it allow them to win? Probably not. But they like to feel like they had some control, whereas now it's more a social experience. And hey, there's a horse called Vanilla Slice. I like the name of that. I'll bet on that. We really do have a dumbed down database of mug punters, and we can potentially move them in the direction that we want.
I see that we had a question in the chat, and so I want to get to that before we run out of time. And it came from Sonia Chen, who I don't understand the context behind this, but perhaps you do, can provide some color. Sonia asked about what might be the issues that emerge from the involvement of Entain in the New Zealand market, and what New Zealand might be able to learn from overseas experience.
I think Entain experience over in New Zealand, it's only, it's in the first inning, so we don't really know how it's going to play out. But I think in general, you've gone from a and I don't mean it, well, I probably do mean it disrespectfully, maybe an underperforming monopolistic situation to now having a best in class, one of the leading global wagering operators who are over there. So what are we going to see? There was a view that you'd probably see margins go up, and I think from what I understand and having discussions with Entain, it's probably going to be the opposite. They are going to try to give a more enjoyable experience to the customer, and that means giving them more products. That means giving them more generosity. Again, we're probably going to be heading down a path similar to what we've seen here in Australia, where it's, even though it's not a competitive market over there per se, and they're probably going to end up with a monopolistic structure, you're going to see generosity levels go up. You're going to see advertising levels go up. I think there was on the Everest the other day, there was somebody who picked the finishing order of the 10 horses in the Everest and won $10 million. Now that wouldn't have happened a year ago. That wasn't happening pre-Entain. That's the sort of product we're talking about. We're talking about more fun product, and that was a free-to-enter competition. I imagine they insured themselves, so it doesn't, Entain probably aren't out of pocket particularly much at all. So yeah, I think we're looking down the face of, even though it will be a monopolistic structure in all likelihood, a lot more product, a lot more advertising, undoubtedly a better gambling experience for the customer, but I imagine the market grows. That would be my starting assumption.
Well, Andy, you've been so generous in sharing your time, and your expertise and knowledge is very clear. I want to turn it over to you now to say, is there anything that you would like to have and ask? Is there anything you want to see researchers answer the question of? Is there anything you'd like, industry or regulators? This is your billboard moment to anything that we haven't spoken to you about.
I think the bit that probably hasn't really been detailed to us, and we're probably in a situation where we've got very little idea, and that's in relation to digital, the movement to cashless, some of the trials which are going on in New South Wales and going on in other jurisdictions. It's very hard from a market perspective to kind of understand, even ballpark, what the implications, the ramifications are going to be, what it's going to mean in terms of, if you had 100 units of revenue, what will it look like, and what are the interesting dynamics, and yeah, I guess that's the kind of the black box space at the moment. There's a lot of fear from a lot of investors in relation to this. I think the answer in many cases, it's going to depend on the fine print, and the devil will be in the detail. But I think if researchers at the moment if they were to share a little more, to the extent that they can. I'm not sure what the commercial sensitivities and agreements are, but just to say, hey, we've done a trial and it was run out here, and you know what? This was one of the problems. We struggled to get people to convert because of this, but we found after 30 days that 90% ended up continuing to play, but their play was down by 20, you know, some sort of metrics to give us some sort of ballpark of where the market goes and what the implications are, because it feels like in this case that the researchers are actually in a pretty, I'm not going to say privileged position. I mean, they're there for a reason, and it's great, and you're trying to get the best outcomes for the player. But in a privileged position where you possess information which perhaps isn't necessarily being, it feels like being shared as much as what it might be able to.
I think that's pretty fair, and I can comment on that to the extent that I'm able, because I'm also privy to confidential knowledge. But that's where I guess I will outline that process. The transparency isn't a lack of research transparency. I think that academics and researchers are more than happy, and it's our job to be transparent. In this case, it's the government. So the structure of the trials are through a regulatory sandbox that actually is run by the government, and they are the keepers of the information, and they are the ones that have the contracts saying that the research can't be shared. They're the ones that get to decide what has been done. They're running the independent trials. Well, at least they're the ones holding the information. So I don't think it's a matter of the research team not disclosing. It's a matter of the contracts that they've been signed with the government to not disclose the information. And as you say, the devil will be in the detail, and that is far from confirmed in terms of what the product will look like. Will it be mandatory? Will it be opt-in? Will there be, you know, capped limits? And I think that a lot of that just hasn't simply been decided, but I do appreciate the uncertainty. But it certainly is a good call for more transparency from the government in terms of where things are going. And we do see that sometimes with announcements that come seemingly out of the blue, and I guess out of the blue to me, it doesn't mean it's out of the blue to other people. I just might not know what, like, there are other conversations being had, and that's what this webinar I think is all about, is ensuring transparency and enabling conversations between stakeholders, because it's certainly our belief that, you know, the more people talk and share knowledge and discuss views, even if we don't agree or have the same priorities, that we'll be able to learn. And so I hope that people listening to this have really gained from your expertise and understanding, just this start of an understanding of some of the way that the industry and products are being changed. And really interesting what you shared was the rationale and what's driving those changes, because I think that's really important to consider. The industry doesn't just wake up one day and develop a new product for no reason. They're responding to consumer demand.
Sure.
You know, so I think that's a really interesting highlight, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts.
You're perfectly welcome. Thank you, and continue the good work. It's a great webinar. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. I could have done, I think, another 3 hours of this conversation. It was fantastic, and that was actually a really good question that you posed back to us as researchers, and I'm curious about that myself. So I need to figure out which government I need to send my Freedom of Information request to get some answers here. But that's it for this week. We are completely out of time. Next week, we will be back, and we will be back with Dr. Naomi Muggleton from the Warwick Business School at the University of Warwick. Naomi will be talking about her paper that was a really interesting publication in, I believe it was Nature of Human Behavior, that looked at bank data and how you could infer a lot of information about gambling behavior using banking data. So we'll dig into all aspects of that next week. But for that, we are done for this week. And thank you again, Andy. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Harrison, who's behind the scenes at the Brain and Mind Center. And we'll see you all next Wednesday.